Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us for this research exchange lecture. My name is Camille Crittenden. I direct the Data and Democracy Initiative here at Citrus, and we're delighted to have you here with us in Banatao Auditorium. We're also happy to greet our web viewers and other remote listeners on the UC Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz campuses. I want to also announce an upcoming talk on Friday in the I4 Energy series. It will be Friday at 1 p.m. on algorithms for advanced lighting controls, in case that's of interest for you. Next Wednesday, because of Thanksgiving, there will be no research exchange lecture. I'm sure you'll have other plans, and we'll see you back here 2 weeks from today. This afternoon, I'm really delighted to introduce Caroline Rodier as our speaker. She's the Associate Director of the Urban Land Use and Transportation Center, or ULTRANS, at the University of California, Davis. Her major areas of research include transportation and land use planning and environmental policy analysis. Her interests include the development and application of land use and transport models. At ULTRANS, she manages the development of 2 California statewide models, an activity-based micro-simulation travel model and a spatial economic model, as well as an activity-based micro-simulation travel model for the San Joaquin Valley region, which I'm sure you'll hear more about this afternoon. She previously served as senior researcher here at UC Berkeley, where she evaluated behavioral effects of new transportation technology. She has designed and implemented research evaluation programs for transit and truck smart parking systems, shared use low-speed modes, and automated speed enforcement systems. So please join me in welcoming Caroline Rodier.
Thank you, Camille. Let's see, I've just got to take care. Supposed to press this button, I think, here. Am I hooked up? Can you hear me? You have to press it for a couple seconds. Just need this button. Okay, thank you. Okay. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. So the title of my presentation today is Achieving Climate Change Goals from Land Use and Transportation Planning in California, Emerging Technology for Analysis and Monitoring. So I'd just like to start out by thanking Brandon Haydu and Nico Leinich, who's actually sitting in the audience today. They are ULTRANS researchers who made a major contribution to the presentation that I'm making today. And I'd also like to thank the Hewlett Foundation for their financial support of this research. So emerging information technology in the areas of transportation and land use planning can be used to inform policy design and monitoring frameworks needed to implement California's climate change laws. New data and modeling technologies developed for the state of California can be applied to illustrate how the following questions can be explored. First, the magnitude of planned land use and transportation policies, the sensitivity of vehicle travel to specific demographic trends that are anticipated, and third, geographic disparities in the effects of auto pricing policies. So, this is an overview of the presentation today. I'm going to start out with a very brief description of the climate change legislation in California that motivates this research and has also spurred the development of new data and modeling systems, including the California statewide activity-based travel model. And then we apply this model to illustrate how policy designs and monitoring questions can be evaluated using these models. And then I make some brief conclusions. Okay, legislative background. So California was the first state in the nation to pass climate change legislation. And this climate change legislation requires dramatic reductions in greenhouse gases. The Global Warming Solution Act, AB 32, requires that greenhouse gas emissions be reduced to 1990 levels by 2020. And former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's executive order required that greenhouse gas emissions be reduced even further to 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. Okay, this next slide is data from ARB's, the California Air Resources Board, for those of you who aren't familiar, data for their AB 32 scoping plan. And this indicates that on-road vehicles are significant contributing factors to GHG emissions in California. Okay, so the California Air Resource Board estimates that a significant reduction in GHGs from passenger vehicles can be achieved through increased vehicle fuel economy as well as decreased carbon content of fuels. Those are considered kind of the first two legs of the stool. However, they also estimated that it would not be enough to achieve 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 without decreasing the growth in vehicle miles traveled. So the legislative answer to this kind of the third leg of the stool, reducing growth in vehicle miles traveled. And then for just backing up a bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with this terminology, I'm not quite sure what backgrounds you come from here. VMT is distance traveled by autos and trucks on roadways. Okay, so the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act is the legislative answer to the third leg of the stool, and it calls on regional transportation planning agencies and local governments to implement 3 key strategies to reduce the growth in per capita VMT. This includes higher density development, investment in transit, and auto pricing policies. Okay, next moving on to emerging data and modeling systems to simulate SB 375 policies. So data and modeling systems used by transportation agencies are typically called travel demand models. The original travel demand model was called the 4-step travel demand model. It was developed about 50 years ago today to plan new and expanded roadway projects. And in some areas of the US, these models still are used quite frequently. These models were improved in the 1990s to better address air quality effects of new roadway projects and alternatives to expanding roadways as part of the requirements of the Clean Air Act amendments. SB 375 has contributed to the development of really a new generation of travel models, particularly in California. There's some that have been applied throughout the US in the context of the federal New Starts requirements. But these frameworks are called activity-based microsimulation travel models. And these models are more capable of representing the types of policies that are called on, that SB 375 call on to be simulated. So they're also known as ABMs. It's a kind of a mouthful to say activity-based travel, microsimulation travel model each time, but so I'll refer to them as ABMs. So these models really take advantage of, new technology advances in computing power, data storage and management systems, geographic information systems, and monitoring technologies. Some of you might be familiar with roadway sensors and that type of data. Okay, so just in general, travel models, they forecast the total quantity of travel. So that's distance and time. They give you estimates of vehicle mile travel, vehicle hours traveled, vehicle hours of delay by different routes. It also represents the quality of travel. So that is how long does it take, and what is the cost. And that's by different modes. So typically, the models represent, driving by car, by a carpool, bus and walk modes. So to and from different destinations, home and work, and then at different times of the day. So, and this is given the location and characteristics of population and employment and the activities they generate on the transportation system. So basically roadways, rail, and bus lines. Okay, there are some kind of key attributes of these activity-based travel demand models. First is they're rooted in microeconomic theory. So it's the probability that an individual traveler selects an alternative is a function of the demographic attributes of that traveler and the relative attractiveness of the alternatives available to the traveler. So a statistical technique known as the population synthesis is also used to generate the individuals and their attributes that are used as the population in the model, the population basis in the model. So it expands the population sample, which is typically a census PUMS record. And then microsimulation, this is a mathematical technique that's used to track individuals, their characteristics and activities, and the attributes of the alternatives that they face. So activities or day patterns, these drive individuals' need to travel and are based on travel survey data. Tours are the unit of analysis used to represent these activities. And these are closed or half-closed chains of trips that start and end at home or at the workplace. And they include at least one destination and 2 successive trips. So I'm going to show you right now an example of some tours. Oops, it's not moving forward. Oh, it must be here. Home to work, work to personal shop, and then back home again. The work is considered the primary destination, and personal shop is a secondary destination. Here we've got a sub-tour from work to personal shop. And this is a little bit more complicated tour. So next I'm going to kind of describe how some of the features of ABMs that differentiate themselves from traditional 4-step models and updated 4-step models. So again, they have a much more detailed representation of demographic inputs. They typically represent household size, age, sex, employment in the household, household income, school enrollment, autos available, and race and ethnicity. These are, typically they're consistent with census attributes. Employment, they're typically more than 6 employment types, and they're based on, for some of you who may be familiar with NAICS categories or occupation categories, SOC codes. They also have an improved representation of space and time. So this enables more accurate representation of travel time and cost, and thus the effectiveness of different policies. So they're smaller zones. Zones are the geographic unit of analysis of these models. Networks, they typically have detailed networks, especially in different regions. Increasingly, they're not just representing all the roads, they're representing rail and bus routes, as well as bike routes and the quality of sidewalks. Increasingly, there's better representation of parking supply and the cost to park in different areas. And roadway tolls are also represented. Time-specific routes of travel by mode, by the different modes, are selected by separate time periods that represent the full 24-hour day. And static assignment methods are most typically used, but increasingly there's experimentation with dynamic processes in models that are actually applied or are planning to be applied. Okay, so this next slide shows where we are with the development of activity-based models for the major regions in California. In the first round of the Sustainable Community Strategy Development, that's what they call the Transportation and Regional Plans under SB 375. So we're currently kind of midway through the first round. So Sacramento and San Francisco are using an ABM. The other regions are still not comfortable. They have developed ABM, or they're almost completed developing them, but they're still using their advanced four-step model. They do intend to use an ABM and land use models for the second round of SCSs. Okay, now I'm going to just briefly discuss the California activity-based model. This model was funded by the state of California, by the California Department of Transportation. And the motivation of this model was largely to represent interregional travel. Most regional models don't explicitly simulate interregional travel. So this was the motivation behind this model. And it was developed jointly by Ultrans researchers and HBA Specto, a consulting firm out of Canada. So the California activity-based travel model, it simulates personal travel and commercial travel within California for all modes and purposes on a typical weekday in the spring and fall. So that would be when school's in session. So it was estimated on year 2000 travel behavior survey data and validated to year 2008 observed travel. So this is kind of a schematic that describes the submodels. Again, we represent both personal travel and commercial vehicle travel. The inputs are zones, roadway network. We do represent transit, which is kind of unusual for for covering such a large geographic scale, population, employment, and other properties. Okay, across the top are the submodels, and then vertically are the modes represented by those different submodels within the California statewide model. SOV refers to single occupant vehicles, and HOVs are carpools, so they're differentiated by 1 and 3+. Okay, these are the time of day that we represent in the model. And this is, the zone system that the model uses. Zones, again, are the geographic unit of analysis. You may, for those of you who are familiar with this, they sometimes call them TAZs. So there's over 5,000 zones that are used by this model. And they're much more detailed in the urban areas of the state. Okay, and this next slide shows the networks, the roadway networks. So there are over 250,000 links. And here we can see the rail lines that are explicitly coded for the statewide model. Local transit is also represented in this model. It represents the quality of in and out of vehicle travel in different zones provided by local bus services. Okay, so now I'm kind of moving on to the research that was conducted as part of this model application work. And I just want to kind of step back and this is the first activity-based model that's really applied at a large geographic level. And what's different about this is we're able to kind of apply the same modeling framework to look at different regions throughout California and provide some kind of apples-to-apples comparison. Most regions develop their own travel models, so it's a little bit more difficult to compare across regions. So moving on, okay. So in this first segment, we're going to look at how to conduct an analysis that helps gauge planned policy implementation. So we collected regional transportation plans and demographic projections from all the regions throughout California, and we developed future year time horizons for 2020, 2035, and 2050. It's important to note that these networks were planned projects as of the summer of 2011, and they do not represent the latest SCS plans by the regions. The demographic forecasts are a little bit more recent. We collected those as of March 2012. So, this is a demonstration of what can be done. These are not actually what is going on in SCS plans. They're more representative of the previous round of regional transportation plans, also known as RTPs, for those of you who aren't familiar. Okay, so this map shows the regions that we kind of used to categorize the presentation of our results today. The Sacramento, San Francisco, SCAG, and Los Angeles and San Diego areas represent the regional transportation planning agencies in those areas. And the San Joaquin Valley area represents the 8 county MPOs that comprise the San Joaquin Valley. Okay, this next slide shows the 2008 distribution of rail hours, lane miles, population, and VMT by California region. So you can see, it's kind of interesting to see how it breaks down. San Francisco has a large share of rail hours relative to other places throughout the US. Lane miles and population are fairly closely related to VMT, and this is in the base year 2008. Okay, this next slide shows the relative trends in population growth rates and VMT growth rates. So you can see here which regions are expected to grow more quickly and which regions are expected to have higher growth in VMT. And you can get a sense from this of where, throughout the different time periods, there might be somewhat of a greater growth of VMT relative to population. Okay, in this next slide, we look at the difference in annual growth rates. So that's VMT minus population. So that's by the California region for these different time horizons. And as I mentioned before, the statewide model represents both commercial and vehicle travel. And we can see that for a couple of regions in 2008 to 2020, it looks like VMT increases faster than the population growth rate. We were able to look at the model results and see that this was driven by increases in commercial vehicle travel and not by personal travel. Actually, personal travel declined during that time horizon across all regions. So in the outer years, which of course are much more uncertain, and we have fewer, not as good understanding of what actually might be planned and applied in that time period, we see that actually in the Sacramento area and the San Joaquin Valley, there's a potential that both personal and commercial vehicle travel could increase faster than the population growth rate. Okay, this next slide shows a change in highway lane miles from 2008 to 2050 by California region. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this concept, but all else being equal, if we expand highways, we expect for there to be an increase in VMT. So this slide shows that there's a declining rate in VMT-inducing highway expansion over time. And we can kind of see the distribution of where that expansion is going and what regions. Okay, this next slide shows the average annual growth rate in highway lane miles from 2008 to 2050, again by California region. And according to the plans, the last RTP for Sacramento, it did have the highest growth rate, average annual growth rate, but that's not the current SCS. That's the RTP before their current SCS, which was approved in the fall. And that's followed by the San Joaquin Valley, but those regions are the fastest growing regions and expected to be the fastest growing regions in the state based on MPO forecasts regional planning forecasts. They're also known as MPOs. Okay, here we're looking at total change in daily rail hours, 2008 to 2050. These don't include the high-speed rail hours, just so you know. So you can see that the peak is in the 2020 to 2035 time period. And again, the distribution. Okay, average annual growth rate in rail hours, 2008 to 2050. You can see that San Diego has the fastest growing rate. That is actually representative of their sustainability community strategy. Last night we checked the numbers for the Sacramento region, and those are closer to 3% annual growth rate in rail hours. They've increased since their last RTP. Okay, so this is our next slide, and it's a bit complicated, so bear with me. We spent a lot of time developing this. So, okay, here we're looking at percent of zones and densities in zones with and without transit. So as I described before, the geographic unit of analysis in these travel models are zones. So what we did is we categorized all the different zones by either having bus and or rail, or not having bus or rail. So the red lines are zones with bus and rail, and the blue lines have absolutely no transit at all. So as you move, if you look at the bottom axis, the horizontal bottom axis, we've got increasing years, and we've also got increasing persons per acre. So that represents densities. So the distributions for the blue line represent the distribution of density for zones with no transit, and then their frequency or proportion. And the red lines represent the increase in density and the relative frequency. So you can see that over time, the red line is shifting to the right, which indicates that, in fact, zones with transit are becoming more dense. And you see the red line shifting up somewhat, so you see that they're increasing in frequency, and the blue lines are shifting down, so there are less zones without transit. And we did some statistical tests, and they did indicate that the means and the distributions are significantly different. So, we are, even according to last plans, we are making progress. But of course, we have to watch to see if these plans are actually implemented. SB 375 doesn't give regional agencies the authority to actually implement land use plans. That's still really held with the local governments. But this is one way to look at it over time across the various jurisdictions. Okay, and this just is kind of a summary of how we could think about monitoring these different investments and policy changes. As I mentioned before, highway capacity, is expected to likely induce VMT, so you want to make kind of keep track of that. We saw that it was increasing at a declining rate. If that trend changes, then VMT and GHG in the future may be underestimated, and we may have more difficulty attaining our greenhouse gas goals. Rail hours and higher densities in transit, they have a negative VMT elasticity, and so we saw that the rail hours are increasing at a higher magnitude than highway capacity, which is good. And then we saw significant increases in densities. So if we expect those trends to continue, that would tend to reduce VMT. However, if they change, then we would be underestimating VMT and GHG. It's a pretty simple example, but it's also pretty transparent and something that you can communicate to stakeholders with and decision makers to kind of monitor what's actually going on. Sometimes it's hard to figure it out when all those 500-page documents from regional planning agencies. Okay, sensitivity of travel to demographic trends. Okay, so here we're looking at the sensitivity of vehicle travel to demographic trends, again, that are anticipated by regional planning agencies. So we compare the rate of population growth to VMT growth of the specific demographic groups over time. So here we have got the distribution of households by size. And here we have annual percentage change in household size from 2008 to 2050. So you can see that households with 2 and 3 people in the household overall have a faster growth rate. However, if you compare this to the growth in VMT, they generate relatively lower VMT than do 1 and 3 and 4 plus people in a household. Okay, total households by number of children by California region. It's expected, 0 households without children dominate. And this is the annual percentage change in the number of children per households from 2008 to 2050. And 0 and 3 plus children households have a relatively higher growth rate. Oops, I did the wrong. Okay, here we see that 0 and 3 plus households have relatively lower rates of VMT associated with them. Okay, this next slide shows total household by income groups by California region. So there's, the overall higher households are expected to become somewhat more wealthier. You can see that results here are varied. In some areas, VMT is actually higher for lower income groups. In this analysis, we're not controlling for the effects of different demographic groups in the trend. But it may be that in those regions, poor people are living in more outlying suburban areas. And they may also co-vary with other demographic groups that could increase this VMT. Okay, households by number of vehicles available by California region. See again, we're still got 2 plus dominating, 2 plus available per household. So we see there's a slight increase in 0-car households over time. And as you might expect, more cars, more VMT. The trend is somewhat different in San Francisco, and this may be due to higher levels of congestion and good transit service that discourage VMT growth. Okay, population by age group by California regions. Okay, no surprise, there's a growth in individuals over 65. Higher growth rate there. And interestingly, currently this age group is associated with higher rates of VMT. So conclusions, here a similar kind of summary. 4 of the 5 demographic groups, they basically, the groups within those, the subgroups within those groups that grow the fastest also have the lowest VMT growth rate. So if those trends change, then VMT and GHGs could be underestimated. So that's also something to keep an eye on. But the opposite is true for population by age. Those over 65 are thought to, it's highly likely they'll increase most quickly. Their VMT growth rates are considered the highest. I don't think we really know what the baby boomers' travel patterns will be yet. So that's something to look into. And then, but it's not a bad problem because we would be likely to if it's overestimated, we would more likely be able to meet our GHG goals. Okay, just quickly here, looking at geographic disparities of distance-based auto pricing policies. So we applied to the ABM, the statewide ABM, we looked at doubling the cost of auto travel in 2035. And this graphic shows how that affects per person VMT in each of the zones, within the counties and the region. So we found a very, pretty significant decrease. It's larger on average than that obtained from land use and transit policies. But you can see that, the areas at the darkest green area, per person VMT is being reduced from about 15 miles a day to 50 miles a day. And you can see that there are large swaths of those areas in the Central Valley and outlying suburbs of Sacramento and the Bay Area. And it's hard to imagine that, this kind of tax would not have a negative effect on people's ability to access work and other essential services. It's pretty dramatic. Okay, this is the Southern California area, and you see the same trend, the ex-urban areas. So, in thinking about this, this auto pricing policies are quite effective in reducing VMT. They may increase over time just due to market pressures. This might, we might think about different kind of infrastructure investments we could make in more urban areas to allow shifts from the ex-urban areas into the downtown areas, redevelopment. And there is some thought in the literature that this actually might be appealing to the millennial generation, living closer to the downtown in smaller areas that have good walk and biking facilities. Okay, just to summarize, I think these activity-based models provide an efficient platform to summarize the relative magnitude of planned changes in policies and demographic trends, which can be communicated to stakeholders and the public. These plans are input based on regional plans, and their effects are simulated with travel models as part of existing funding and regulatory processes. The platform can also be used to summarize changes in the actual implementation of planned policies and infrastructure and how that would affect the achievement of SB 375 goals. So this new generation of data management and modeling tools in land use and transportation are just emerging. And here we just presented some of the ways in which it can be applied. So California's made a big investment in these tools, and they really should be capitalized in order to track and monitor implementation and achievement in greenhouse gas goals and to improve policy design over time. Thank you.
So do we have any questions? Hang on.
I think she's managing.
Use the microphone so people can see this online. Thank you.
You have made some rather daring long-range projections, but you haven't really told us what assumptions you've made behind these projections and what the basis is, where they come from. For instance, what is the assumption about the business climate 10 or 20 years from now, which strongly depends on business? What is the price of gasoline that you assume to be in 10 or 20 years? And would a model like yours have been able to, say, forecasting the housing debacle we had a few years ago if you had, run that model in early 2000 something? So there seem to be so many factors that can completely throw this picture off. So how can you dare to make these long projections all the way 40 years out?
Well, it's actually not me making these long-range. The inputs were obtained from regional planning agencies that actually do forecast the future and the effects of different policies on the future. So this is basically a compilation of the plans and forecasts that were available from regional planning agencies and in some cases state planning agencies. So that is kind of the basis of what we were doing. And no, it could not forecast the housing debacle. This is not, we take land use as an input. So it's one way of looking at the problem, but I do think it's an efficient way to kind of summarize the underlying assumptions that the model use and how that's driving trends in VMT. That was the kind of goal of this presentation.
I think those graphs need some error bars to keep everybody sort of in perspective.
Oh, there's plenty of errors, but it's not, yeah.
A question here? Excuse me.
Thank you. I have a question. If I put myself into the position of a policymaker, and I can see how our vehicle miles traveled influenced by this or that policy, that doesn't really solve the problem for me. As you indicated with the change in prices of operating an automobile, what happens to the people who are not driving anymore? Are they taking the bus? Are they jumping into the ocean? Are they changing the job? This is actually what would be interesting because the politician needs to know how viable is this policy proposal. What am I proposing people to do?
Yeah, and unfortunately I didn't, our model can explore that, and I just didn't have time in the presentation to present those results. But yes, more people would walk and bike, and more people would take transit. They would tend to take shorter trips or not travel in this model.
I'm curious to know, in the talk description, there was something about emerging information technologies, and there was no real mention of what particular emerging information technology methodology other than just ABMs in general. How did you get your data? Was it something different from what other people have done for ABMs, or not really?
Is it different? No, I mean, it's data that's available broadly for the state of California. We collected that data and had to do a significant amount of cleaning and organization and combining. You know, we had huge data sets. For example, we used loop detector data for the validation of roadway flows. And previously, that data had not been cleaned. It had not been organized into a usable form. And we were able to use, GIS and different data management systems to actually take that data, clean it up, and use it for validation. But I mean, there are different regions use different data sources for what they do.
So the IT stuff you're talking to is the management part of it, not acquiring new data.
Yes,
So,
yes.
okay.
I have a question about the doubling of the automobile operating costs. Could you talk a little bit about what that includes? Are you talking about increasing the price of gasoline, or is this congestion pricing of some kind, or what's...
It would be a distance-based fee.
Okay, so it doesn't have to do with the price of gasoline or the actual price of the vehicle itself?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing whether your models do or could include estimates of quality of each mode of transportation. Things like, the congestion on the roads, or whether you can eat or drink or go to the bathroom or rely on the schedule of public transit and so forth, because those presumably could have an impact on the choices people make.
Okay, so actually the model has kind of a physical network, and it assigns travel to the network to estimate travel, basically, how long it would take to travel by a car, how long it would take to travel by a bus, walking and biking, and also costs associated with those modes like bus fares, costs of parking. Increasingly, there is better representation of bike routes and sidewalks. That's not the case in our model because we cover such a large geographic area. But the schedule reliability, that's something we're kind of working on. You always think, well, maybe that will come up, be represented in the alternative specific constant. But yeah, that's a valid question and something I think that we still continue to work on.
Yeah, I was kind of interested in the connection between the number of people in a household and the vehicle miles traveled, and then also the increase in population, which would necessitate an increase in the number of households. And it just seems like all of that data, all of those data working together make sort of a really impossible tangle to figure out what the effect is really going to be. And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, I think it is a complicated question. I mean, there are a lot of factors that go on in, what's going to affect the future and the quantity of travel. We look at it from different ways, and there may be a different way of analyzing it. We can conduct kind of statistical analyses on the outputs of the data, and we haven't done that yet. What I was trying to do here is kind of show a very simple way in which it could be done, and your feedback's very good. Maybe it's not simple enough. In a way that we could explain to the public. Sometimes statistical methods those analyses are a little bit harder to understand for the general public.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank you again for giving us a fantastic talk.
Okay, thank you.